and welcome to this week's episode of the Good Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everyone that watched the last episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Apologies for no show last week. I'll be honest, I was doing a private whiskey tasting on the previous Saturday, which finished quite late, and I don't think I'd have done this lot very much justice if I'd have attempted to do an episode of the show last week. So I just thought best to not to do that, rather to, last thing I want to do is a half-assed job at the end of the day. So anyway. As you can see from this week's title page, I'm looking at the summer releases from Dram Mor. Yes, I know technically summer has now exited stage left, but I'm kind of catching up with things, as they say. It's, you go through sort of periods of time where you get sort of very little in the way of samples, and then suddenly you get a load coming in all at once, and you have to sort of work through them, and it's a difficult job, I can tell you. That's all I can say. And then you have to write the tasting notes up, and all so on and so forth, and then you actually have to sort of like go, right, do I want to buy some of this stuff, and anyway. So firstly, a big thank you to Victoria from Dram Mor for kindly sending me the samples. I don't need to go into any great detail about the company because I've done episodes of the show on them previously. I think I included, mind you, it's actually been about a year since I last did a whole episode of the show on Dram Mor, but I think I included one or two of their bottlings in a fairly recent show, if memory serves me correct. But anyway, I'm kind of waffling, and so I shall stop and just introduce today's lineup. Right, okay, so we're going to kick off with a 27-year-old Invergordon. This is a single refill bourbon barrel, number 30709, distilled in 1997, bottled of this year at 52.2%. Now, I've been banging on for years and years and years, more years than I care to remember, about how good old grain can be, and it seems that obviously I'm not going to take all the credit for the sales of old grain whiskey, but obviously it's more popular now than it ever has been, and unfortunately independent bottling companies have realised that, and the prices have gone not quite stratospheric, but they are pretty expensive these days. With the exception of this particular bottling, I will say that Victoria has done a remarkable job at keeping the price under control. It hits the shelves at less than 85 quid for a 27-year-old grain. Pretty impressive, I think. But anyway, so the price is really good, but of course, it's the juice that's in the bottle that counts at the end of the day. Bottling number 2 is a 7-year-old Dalmunach. This is a single first fill Buffalo Trace barrel, number 670, distilled in 2016, bottled this year at 58.4%. Now, I don't really know an awful lot about Dalmunach. I've only ever come across it once before, and I think that was a Duncan Taylor Octave bottling, which was fairly heavily sherried, if memory serves me correct. So, although this is a first fill bourbon cask, I'm hoping that it will give me some kind of inkling into the character of the distillery. Bottling number 3 is a 10-year-old Tamnavulin, again refill bourbon barrel, 110915, distilled in 2013, bottled this year at 55.3%. One of the things I really like about Dram Mor is the fact they don't seem to have got caught up in all this kind of, my God, we've got to finish everything in a wonderful or weird bloody cask. I think some independents have got far too fixated on trying to make their Blair Athol different to the other independents bottling of Blair Athol, and they've kind of lost sight of the kind of the fact that sometimes it's nice just to taste a good bottling of Blair Athol, not a Blair Athol that's been finished in a God knows what kind of cask. But anyway, so apart from the final bottling, all American oak, which I'm really happy about. Bottling number 4 is an Auchroisk. I think that's how you pronounce it. I remember a Scottish rep trying to teach me how to sort of pronounce Auchroisk properly, and it does involve sort of getting your tongue into a strange contortion and spitting. Yeah. So anyway, this is a 15-year-old Auchroisk, first fill bourbon, hogshead 816758, distilled in 2008, bottled this year at 54.1%. Yes, you'll notice a lack of glasses at this end. I've lost another Glencairn. You know, they just break too damn easy. Anyway, so this is an 8-year-old Glenglassaugh, 32, bottle of 52.2%. This is finished in first fill cognac. It is cask number 67, distilled in 2015 and bottled this year. And the final bottling of the afternoon is another finish. You've got to do the occasional finish, haven't you? This is a Glen Moray 13-year-old. First fill white port hogshead finish, cask number 800-597, distilled in 2010, bottled this year at 56%. So an interesting lineup, like I said. I mean, obviously there are a couple of cask finishes, so Dram Mor have obviously not been sort of immune to the cask finishing craze, but it's nice to see the bulk of the bottlings are, you know, American oak and hopefully sort of, you know, indicative of the distillery. And like I said, quite looking forward to finding out what Dalmunach is all about. So, but before we get to that point, we've got an old grain to start. Right, okay, so 27-year-old Invergordon refill bourbon barrel. Let's see what the nose goes on this end. Quite aromatic, lots of vanilla, sawn wood, dried tangerine, apricot. Quite light. It's Invergordon is in that sort of lighter style of grain spirits. There's a little bit of a nip there, but you know what? I love the freshness of this. It's beautifully fresh, and really isn't showing its age. Well, I mean, as you well know, you know, you really shouldn't be bottling grains from, well, yeah, 20, 25 years of age. You know, they need time in the cask to develop a little bit more complexity. And you know what? I like this. I think this has got a lovely complexity. It's not too young. It's just right, said the daddy bear, as they say. Let's see what that's like. That's lovely. So it shows more of the sort of grainy dried fruits on the palate, sort of, you know, sultana, dried citrus, nice creamy oak on the mid palate, a little bit of coconut, a bit of wood spice, a lovely note of wood smoke right on the finish. It's a little masked, obviously. It is it's only just over the 50% at 52, but you could drink that without the necessity for water, and you know, I think that's absolutely gorgeous. But I am going to put a little drop of water to see how it deals with it. I'm hoping it doesn't actually all fall apart. Actually, it's kind of brought forward or brought out that kind of more classic rummy sort of dried fruit, grain dried fruit character. A little bit more floral now, possibly, a little bit less oak. Touch of coffee now, possibly, sort of milky coffee. I mean, that's a lovely nose. I mean, either with or without water, I'm more than happy with this. Let's see what that's like now. A little sweeter on the palate. Coconut macaroons I'm getting now. Less oak again. The oak has kind of like regressed somewhat, so we are more about the spirit, and there's pleasant maturity in the spirit. It's not as old as some grains of this age I've tasted. I think it's just really harmonious. It's a lovely grain, and I'd be more than happy to sell that. So good stuff. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Dalmunach. Let's see what the nose gives us on this 7-year-old. Oh, that's a curious nose, it has to be said. There's a lot of oak. Yeah, so a lot of creamy oak, lots of vanilla. There's a sweet sourness kind of going on here. I'm getting some quite astringent citric notes. Tamarind certainly comes to mind. There's some baked apple, some peach. It's a bit of hard barley there, a little bit of an industrial note, toffee. It's interesting. It's got character, and it's not unpleasant. I mean, it's odd. You know, it's not what I was expecting at all. Like I said, it's got this kind of intriguing sweetness and sourness kind of going on, and then it's got quite a bit of chunky oak, but it all seems to work quite nicely. Now, I think this is fairly expensive for a 7-year-old. I think this is, we talk, well, 7-year, they're all about 70 quid now, 60, sort of 70 quid nowadays. You know, you ain't going to get much for less than that, not independent cask strength single cask bottlings anymore. Those days have long since gone, Toto. Yeah, well, I kind of like this. It's a bit of weird and wonderful, but it's not too weird and wonderful, if you see what I mean. Expressive, I think, is a great word for this this nose. Let's see what the pal's like. Again, kicks off with the oak. Again, there's that little industrial barley note right on the finish. We're again in that kind of sweetness and sourness, although it's not so pronounced. There's an almost kind of subtropical note to the fruit, sort of apricot, almost kind of pineapple. It's not sort of overtly juicy and rummy in that kind of tropical kind of sense, but there is a slight tropical note there. And again, like I said, it's got that sourness of fruit as well, which is quite intriguing. Almost kind of like a sour mash kind of note, but maybe more amplified. White chocolate, white licorice on the finish. It's a bit masked. I am going to put a little drop of water with that. I'm really intrigued to see what a drop of water does to this, because it's, like I say, I mean, it's got loads and loads of character. Now, the nose is very much the same. It's got maybe a sort of slightly more herbaceous note coming through now. Nettles, maybe a little bit more citric, and maybe a little less sour. So it's not really the same, is it? I mean, come on. But it's not sort of done anything sort of like, you know, mind-blowingly different. Yeah, I kind of quite like this nose. This is intriguing. Let's see what that's like now. Possibly a little sweeter on the palate now, a little bit more oak. But that sourness is certainly coming through on the finish. I'm certainly getting the tamarind, the lemon, and a slight nettly kind of. It's almost like licking a leaf on the finish. A nettle leaf. Well, I wouldn't go around licking nettle leaves, but you know, it's that kind of flavour. Well, that's what it reminds me of anyway. So overall, intriguing, idiosyncratic, a bit weird, a bit wonderful, but not too weird and wonderful. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 10-year-old Tamnavulin. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Quite oaky, lots of sweet vanilla. There's almost a sort of like a slight fat corn note, toast. But there is some distillery character coming through. I'm getting that sort of light grassy spey note coming through, a little bit of citrus, some barley. I think it's one of these ones that just needs time to sit in the glass. If you aerate it, it does seem to sort of amplify the oak. And so when you first stick your nose in it, you go, yeah, that's a lot of oak. But you kind of have to sort of like give it a little bit of time to sit. There's some almost kind of floral white flowers. Yeah, Yeah, I think that's a lovely nose. I really like that. It's got balance once you let it sit. Let's see what that's like. Again, kicks off with the oak, coconut, peanut, vanilla, quite masked in actual fact. Lovely juicy mouth-watering finish as the citrus and the alcohol kind of combine. On the mid palate I'm getting vanilla, I'm getting a little bit of sort of malt, a little bit of barley, and then on the finish, like I said, that sort of alcohol enhanced citrus. Lovely progression, I really like that. And I bang on and on about progression in an inordinate amount of times, but you know, I don't find a whiskey that kind of delivers everything in one go to be as interesting as a whiskey that just opens up and takes you on a little bit of a journey. Being arsey. I like that. That's really good. Let's put a little drop of water with that and see what that does. Maybe that sweetens things, just knocks off the acidity and the citric notes. Yeah, it has done that. It's made the nose quite sweeter, a lot more sort of oak coming through now. But you know what? Again, it's not sort of overly oaked. I think I prefer the nose without water, but I certainly don't think it's detracted putting a little drop of water. Let's see what that's like. Well, it's certainly not removed too much of the acidity and too much of the citric notes. I mean, it's still really nicely balanced. It's really juicy, it's mouth-watering, it's got some nice oak, some barley, it's very summery. I mean, I know the weather is certainly not summery today, it's been honking it down here, but that's a good whiskey. Don't feel ashamed, step inside and transform. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Auchroisk. So this is 15 years old, first fill bourbon hoggy. Let's see what nice good is. Oh yes, that's a bourbon hoggy. That's a first fill bourbon hoggy. That's a lot of oak. That's an absolute forest. I mean, that's toffee and caramel and vanilla and sawn wood and sawn wood and vanilla and toffee. There is a bit of distillery character there. There is some gooseberry. There's some burnt biscuits. It's a bit kind of overly oaked, in my opinion. It's gone a little bit over into the dark side. Yes, there is an element of distillery character there. I get the gooseberry, I get the green fruit, but that biscuity note, that it's burnt biscuits, is just a little bit kind of out of place. I'm not really loving it. Let's see what the pal's like. Quite soft, quite juicy, white fruits, apple, pear, peach. Again, quite a lot of oak, vanilla-y, soft, milky, quite tannic on the mid palate. It's quite masked. It's some edgy green fruit. I will say the balance is slightly better on the palate, but again, it's kind of, it's a bit, you feel the oak and the spirit kind of fighting with each other. It just doesn't really feel particularly harmonious. It's kind of, there's not a great deal of progression, like I said. It's kind of almost like a fight in your mouth at the end of the day between the spirit and the oak. And although I don't think it's a bad whiskey, it just lacks that kind of progression, I think. It lacks that kind of elegance. And let's see what a little drop of water does. Oh my God, that's really sweet marzipan, almond paste, bitter almonds. That really is just overloaded the nose with oak. I mean, that has made it, unfortunately, rather one-dimensional. Let's see what that's like. it's nice. It's all very nice. Again, it's kind of brought out the oak. It's all soft and sweet and vanilla-y and marzipan-y, and the little element of kind of green Speyside fruit that's kind of just dissipated into the ether, and it's just oak really now. And as I've often said, it's not just sort of big sherry monsters that really don't float my boat. It's big American oak monsters that don't float my boat either at the end of the day. I want progression, I want balance, I want harmony, and unfortunately this just doesn't have it, It's one of those things. Right, okay, so moving on to the Glenglassaugh first fill cognac hogshead finish. Intriguing, interesting. Let's see what the nose gives us. A profusion of cognac cask, it has to be said. I don't know how long it's been in the cognac cask. I would guess from this probably a year or two maybe. No more than sort of, I wouldn't have thought more than the sort of 24 months, something like that. But as you can guess, it's a lot of cognac. It's kind of fresh apple, oxidised apple, vanilla, sweet oak. Again, it's a bit unbalanced. I'm getting a bit of malt. I'm getting a bit of some dark dried fruits. I'm getting no coastal notes. I'm getting, this has probably spent practically, very little time, I would imagine, at Glenglassaugh. I mean, Glenglassaugh does exhibit some kind of coastal character because it's a coastal distillery at the end of the day. But I don't get any of this. It's probably spent most of its life in a warehouse in Glasgow, I would imagine. I'm not. There's nothing against that, These things kind of happen, but it's kind of. It's not particularly intriguing. It's just, on paper looks really, really intriguing, but the nose just is too much cognac. See what the pass like. Like the nose really, it's kind of fresh and oxidised apple, a little bit of spice, a little bit of cinnamon, some malt, a little bit of fruit, but again it's kind of very heavily influenced by the cask. It's quite mastered, not a lot really going on other than the finishing cask, and this is always the problem with finishing whiskies. It's not an exact science at all. And a lot of the casks are finished for too long. You think, well, 12 months, 18 months isn't that long, but then suddenly, when you taste it and you go, well, it is actually, because it's a first fill wine cask and it's just basically dumped an entirety of wine into the whiskey. Maybe if you'd left it a little while longer, maybe a few years, it might have kind of harmonised out. But the trouble is, it just seems that these whiskies are kind of bottled a little bit too soon. Doesn't make a great deal of difference to the nose, it has to be said. It's still pretty cognac-y, lots of baked apple, dried apple, fresh apple. Not a great deal of distillery. Well, there isn't any distillery character. So let's see what it passes like. A bit like the previous bottling, the Auchroisk. One-dimensional, it's all about the cask, there's not a great deal of interest there, it's very pleasant, but it's not particularly exciting, so thumbs down on that one, I'm afraid. Right, okay, so let's move on to the final whisky of the afternoon. This is the White Port Hogshead finished Glen Moray. Again, another interesting one on paper. Let's see if the nose is interesting. Dense, winey, honeyed, lots of oxidised white fruit, apricot, floral honey, menthol, herbal biscuits. That's an interesting nose. I'm not getting a great deal of distillery character. It's quite wild, it's quite untamed. It's very sort of white port influenced, and again, I think the balance isn't just there for me. It has to be said. It's an interesting nose, but again, I just think it's spent too long in the finishing cask. Anyway, let's see what that's like. Wow, that's alcoholic. I mean, it's only 56%, but it tastes like it's 65%. It really does. Really must. I mean, my mouth is just watering uncontrollably. Again, it's all cask, I'm afraid. It's kind of, you know, white fruits, oxidised fruits, honey. Yeah, okay, so Glen Moray does occasionally exhibit a sort of a slight honeyed note. I will give it that. So maybe there is a bit of distillery character there, but it's pretty much all about the cask. It's mentholated on the finish. It's a little bit tart as well. Chuck in the alcohol as well, and that's a hell of a finish. It has to be said. It's kind of drying my mouth out uncontrollably. It's an interesting whiskey. It's an impressive whiskey insofar that yes, you don't see a lot of white port finished whiskey but it is just again too much cask and not enough trousers at the end of the day. Let's put a little drop of water and see if that mitigates some of that cask. It's still pretty winey. It's still very cask orientated. There's possibly a little bit of malt coming through, a little bit more honey, but again, I don't know whether that honey is the distillery character or whether that's coming from the cask or not. So yeah, let's see what that's like. A bit more biscuity now, I suppose. A little bit of white chocolate. Again, oxidised fruit. It's like bitterness on the finish. Again, I'm not really getting an awful lot of Glen Moray character, it has to be said. So, for me, technically, I'm not really that impressed. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Firstly, again, a big thank you to Victoria from Dram Mor for the samples for today's episode of the show. I hope you think this has kind of been a balanced review, as always. At the end of the day, this is wholly my opinion and obviously has nothing at all to do with the company that employs me, just to make certain of that. And I think it's been a bit of a tale of two halves at the end of the day. I mean, it kicked off with the Invergordon, the 27-year-old Invergordon, which was bloody good at the end of the day. A lovely cask of mature-ish grain, good price. What more can you ask? You know, great way to start the tasting. The Dalmunach, I like the Dalmunach. It was a bit weird, it has to be said. You know, it had this kind of sweetness and sourness kind of going on. It was idiosyncratic. But it's a distillery I don't really know particularly well. Like I said, I've only ever tasted one other bottling of Dalmunach. So yeah, I'm happy to sell you guys that. You know, it's kind of idiosyncratic, but in an interesting and drinkable way. I mean, there are idiosyncratic whiskies that are purely, utterly undrinkable, but that I liked. The Tamnavulin I thought was absolutely spot on. You know, beautiful complexity, lots of progression. It moved through the gears really nicely. You know, American oak hoggy, just leave it at that. You know, sometimes the simplicity is the best thing, I think. The Auchroisk, although an American oak hoggy, a first fill American oak hoggy, just a little bit too much oak. You know, it just kind of impacted on the complexity. Yes, all right, there was a little bit of green sort of Speyside fruit going on, but it just didn't have the balance or the progression of, say, the Tamnavulin, for argument's sake. And then into the two finishes. I mean, you know, Yeah, I am tough on finishes. I mean, there are so many, and these two unfortunately kind of fell into that category of where the finish becomes a little too overwhelming. And certainly, I think with the Glenglassaugh, it was very much too influenced by the cognac, and I didn't get enough Glenglassaugh character. And sometimes it's kind of like, you know, why? I mean, why finish Glenglassaugh? I mean, I suppose, okay, yes, you think Glenglassaugh has got that kind of like maltiness, it's got that kind of, again, slightly idiosyncratic kind of character that theoretically should stand up to a finish quite nicely. And I've tasted sherry finished Glenglassaughs that have been quite interesting. But the trouble is, of course, again, you've got to keep an eye on the finish. Otherwise it becomes, you know, it just goes OTT at the end of the day. And unfortunately this just went slightly too far. And the Glen Moray, I mean, again, it's kind of like, you look at sort of, you know, things like this and sort of Inchgower and sort of other sort of citricy, delicate Speyside whiskies, and you go, why in God's name are you shoving that into a wine cask or a sherry cask? Because you know, unless you're really on top of it and really judicious and give it a really short finish, the spirit is just going to get overwhelmed really quickly, because it has not got it doesn't have the cojones to kind of deal with it, you know, and I don't think Glen Moray does. It is quite an elegant, delicate spey, which I find doesn't really deal with finishes and all that well. And you know, although it's a white port finish and it's really different and it's interesting, and you don't see very many white port finishes, and a lot of people would probably buy it on because of that, I just don't think it really had enough complexity and enough kind of balance between the two at the end of the day. So like I said, that's my opinion on that one. But you know, a 50% hit on a selection of samples, I think is doing pretty good, to be bluntly honest with you. There are, you know, an awful lot of you know, releases, independent releases, where I kind of don't even get anywhere close to 50%. But in this instance, I think that was pretty good going. So I have to say, on the whole, you know, an intriguing selection of releases from Dram Mor, and certainly something for everybody. So anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. Hope you've enjoyed it. Got another interesting independent episode lined up for next week, assuming I'll probably still be here in the bloody kitchen, I would imagine, given all the fucking about, honestly, with the wood and the I'm not going to go there. Yeah, somebody's finding that incredibly hysterical in the other room. Anyway, enough of that. Good afternoon and good ramming.
Step inside and transform my curves.